This episode of Troxel is supported by Avail. Content is more than Revit families. If it's digital, Avail can handle it. Learn more at getavail.com. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. This is the podcast where I have conversations with guests from the architectural community and beyond to talk about the coevolution of architecture and technology. In this episode, I welcome back Roderick Bates to the podcast. Roderick is the head of integrated practice at Enscape 3D, where he's responsible for researching industry and market trends, which are shaping the way Enscape customers work. Leveraging that industry knowledge, he collaborates with Enscape product and R&D leaders to assess the new product development opportunities that will shape the future of building design. In this episode, we discuss Roderick's current research foray into what I'll call the road to the metaverse as kind of a catch-all title, and it includes who the major players are that have created the metaverse destinations that are out there, and the tools that creators are using to actually get their designs and environments into those locations. And to provide a little more color to that general overview, beyond the companies themselves, we also discuss the destinations that exist today, the potential the metaverse may have for architects and what value they could bring to it, some of the ethical implications architects practicing or creating content for the metaverse should be thinking about, the positive and negative impacts of immersion, including the possibility for manipulation in these kinds of environments, the architectural tech stack currently needed to become a creator in the metaverse, proactive architectural business model opportunities in relation to the metaverse, and more. I should note that there are many curated links that Roderick provided in the show notes, so I invite you to check those out as well. This was a fantastic conversation with Rod, and I hope you'll not only find value in it for yourself, but that you'll help add value to the profession by sharing it with your network. In addition to leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, which I really hope that you could do for me, it is literally the smallest act of generosity you can do to support this show and to help broaden the reach of conversations like these in my attempt to elevate the industry. I would also appreciate you visiting the sponsors who help make this episode possible. So, without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Roderick Bates. Roderick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Yes, yeah. Welcome back. I should have said that. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited for this conversation. This is the first time on this podcast we are going to broach the subject of metaverse. Some people are triggered by that term alone, right? And they're already shutting this
I was
episode
one of
down.
them.
Yeah,
for sure.
so
Maybe you still am.
If that gives anybody an idea of where this is coming from, it's coming from kind of that skepticism and, just like, let's see what happens with this. But you've had the opportunity to do a deep dive and even prepare a bunch of stuff for a presentation that you gave it built, and you might have given it in other places as well. But the research aspect of it from your point of view is what I'm really interested in hearing, because I haven't had the chance to do that. And I'm sure many of our listeners haven't had the chance to do that. A lot of us are buried in projects and don't have let's just call it the luxury of looking into all of the things. And you also have done kind of this deep dive into the tool sets regarding building the metaverse. So I just want to open it up and maybe you can give a little bit of backstory on why you had the opportunity to look into this deeply, and also then kind of the outcomes of the work that you've put together.
Well, it's rare when you can say you remember exactly when you decide to start looking into or research a particular topic, but in this case, I actually can. And it gets back to your first comment about people having almost an allergic reaction to the metaverse. And I was in a webinar where they were talking about the metaverse, and there's a couple of real metaverse boosters that were there, and I'm sure they're knowledgeable. They have books that were either out or coming out on the topic, so they really knew their stuff, but they weren't talking about the details, about the technology. They were just talking about the concepts in fairly loose terms. And it made me realize that there is a paucity of information that's out there for someone like me, who I would say is not engaged, at least at that time, in the metaverse, to say, okay, really what are we talking about from a technology perspective? And it also linked together with a webinar I had been on where I've been talking about various future opportunities in very general terms, and people are bringing up the metaverse. And one of the audience members had asked me and said, "Hey, this is great that you're talking about it. We're interested. How do I get started?" And I'm rarely at a loss for words, but I was.
Like, because those aren't the dots that are connected when people are talking about the vision and the what ifs of the metaverse and Web3 and NFTs and like all of these things that are kind of playing, they're circling around in the orbits around this big topic of metaverse. And we see a lot of companies who are trying to stake their claims in metaverse and different ways. And so I can only imagine, like, the answer is it depends. How do you get started? Well, what do you want to do with it? What are the tools that are available today? How difficult is it? What kind of learning curve is there? And there's so many pathways. Like, all roads are eventually going to lead to this. It sounds like, but
it is to some degree. But what was interesting for me is a lot of times people would say, "Well, architects have it easy. They already understand virtual spaces and things like that." But that doesn't help anyone. It's almost too generic. So what I wanted to do was really understand what is the technology stack that's out there that can allow for the architectural community to have a play in the metaverse. And it just seemed like it was an opportunity where there was a risk of it passing architects by. And when I started to look in and see what was coming through in the news, and I'd see, say, different metaverse buildings that might be publicized, I don't want to necessarily name names, but these are ones that would be in the Wall Street Journal or something like that. And they were no great shakes from an architectural perspective. And I was thinking, boy, there's a great opportunity here for architects to bring their design sense, almost an obligation for architects to bring their design sense to the metaverse. So that was what started the topic. And how I decided to execute it was to do a couple of different things. The first one is really define the metaverse in a sense. And as you noted, there's this idea of NFT, Web3, things like that. But I wanted to maybe not take such a theoretical view of the metaverse and say, okay, what about the actual metaverse environments that are out there right now? And when people are saying, oh, we have a metaverse or a place in the metaverse, you talk to Sotheby's or Vice Media or something like that, what do they really mean? So there's really a handful of these more formalized metaverse environments that are out there. The most famous being Decentraland. Then you have Somnium Space, Mona, Roblox, Fortnite, different things like that. So with those, we basically started playing in the metaverse and started to understand what are the strengths associated with each one. Are they public? Are they private? Do they support gaming? Are they better for live entertainment? Things like that. But then also the technology side of it, like, is it purely proprietary? Their system for, say, like modeling components. What are the size limits associated with them and things like that? And then from there, be able to, once we sort of digested the opportunities in each one of those metaverse, then look at, like you were saying, the tech stack. Like, how do we get into the metaverse? What is the normal pathway? And so it reminded me of my childhood and the choose your adventure books, right?
Right.
You
Yes.
say, oh, I want to do
those.
this, then you got to do this and this and
Flip
this.
to this page, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
That was fun.
And that's the metaverse, right? There isn't a one path. It's not like buildings where you have schematic design development, that sort of thing. It depends on what your particular outcome was or had in mind. But from that, we were able to actually relatively quickly define the tech stack that was involved. And what was interesting is it wasn't terribly foreign. If you were an architect, there was actually a lot of the components that people are really familiar with. People were using things like Vectorworks, Rhino, SketchUp, 3ds Max, things like that people were really familiar with. But then there was this whole other component where you had pieces that people weren't necessarily familiar with. You're using, like, say, Blender, which to some degree some people are familiar with, but like Unity, ZBrush, things like that, Maya. But when we looked at it and we took a step back, we thought, boy, architects are awfully close to understanding a lot of the technology stack associated with this. So then it came down to really starting to understand how people that are in it right now got there and what does their design methodology look like? How do they even say, get the projects in the first place? So for a lot of people, that was always the question of like, how do I even meet the right people and things like that. So we did a deep dive into understanding what are the social networks that people are a part of that allows for them to even meet people within the metaverse and things like that. And then we closed out with what we think the future may look like, because one of the big discoveries was that these traditional metaverse environments, when people think of the metaverse and these very defined places that are out there, like I say, Decentraland being a good prime example, is that the graphics are pretty poor. It's like if you play video games in the 80s, you'll feel comfortable. And and when you think about where, say, video games are now, or the quality of visual immersion that's possible in architecture, during the design process, it's incredible, right? It's almost photoreal, or sometimes it's almost more real than real. And yet, what you saw in this metaverse environment wasn't that. So then we talked to a lot of folks who were moving to essentially work further apart from these traditional metaverse environments so they can deliver that type of visual quality that they wanted, that they knew was possible, but wasn't possible in the traditional metaverse. So we're actually seeing this separate movement away from these traditional metaverse environments, people creating their own spaces for immersion and interaction, whether it be for business or entertainment.
Interesting. And then there's this whole idea of ownership, and there's this layer of like staking property, investing. There's so many other kind of financial incentives or disincentives, depending on who you are, why you may want to look at something versus not. That's what's interesting to me as well, is just kind of the names who are getting involved, that not on the architectural side, but like Tony Hawk, I just saw it. They're going to build a metaverse, give you the ability to build skate parks and kinds of stuff like that in the metaverse. You've got Snoop Dogg in the metaverse. I think is he in Sandbox or Decentraland? I can't even remember.
I think,
one of them.
Yeah, I think he's in Sandbox.
Sandbox.
I'm not sure.
So it's interesting to kind of think about, who do you align with in different ways, and why might you be attracted to go to one. I don't know. It's all the metaverse, but one versus the other. These kind of destinations in the metaverse, right?
Well, there's two big factors, as you noted right there, is the cost. And that's one of the things that I think was a little humbling for me when I first went in there. I thought, let's just buy a plot of land in Decentraland and build something. There's no better way than to do it. And then we quickly found out that we couldn't afford a plot of land in Decentraland given our budget.
You weren't early. You weren't a pioneer. Yeah.
No, not at all. Right. And so that was a big factor. But then you're absolutely right about this idea of what do you want to achieve? And so one of the things that we found, like for instance, if you wanted to have something that really had great visual quality, that maybe was a digital twin, so to speak, of a high-end home, you really couldn't use any of those established metaverse environments because the file size that they supported was so small. Like I think it was in Decentraland, they supported something like, for one plot, you could get 40,000 polys, essentially shape. And like we have, I've seen chairs in an architectural rendering that's got more than that going on.
Sure.
So,
well, it was always kind of a feat of strength, right, for a software package to be able to tell how many polys it would support in an image. And now you see things like Unreal, right, with their nanite technology, where it's just you don't even need to worry about counting the polys anymore, right? So
it's phenomenal, really.
It is. And it's so to kind of think about this from all these different angles and what architects are used to doing. I remember when I was learning 3D, our goal was to make low poly models because polygons were expensive during rendering. And that's not necessarily the case. And that's definitely why games, I was going to say it's not necessarily the case anymore, but when you move into game engines, when you talk about real-time rendering, which obviously you're an expert in, this has been a main topic for a long time, and it's becoming less and less of a one, but that's one of the reasons why we're seeing low fidelity graphic quality in a lot of these places, right? Is because of the technology behind the visualization of the things that people are making and putting into those places. So it's polygons and texture maps and lighting.
Exactly. And that technology is such that the change is unlikely, is one of the things to note with that, given the way they're structured.
Because they're not going to go back and rebuild it.
Yeah,
they would have
exactly.
to at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have to be a complete rebuild. And then the other component I think that's challenging too is that they're a lot of the reason why it looks like that, like I say, it's the amount of computational power that's required and minimizing that, but also the number of people that they want to have in these spaces jointly. So, if you want these bigger crowds and things like that, that's a lot of complexity to manage also. So that's why, from my perspective, it was interesting to hear a lot of people saying we're rejecting these traditional metaverse environments and want to create something our own. Like you're saying, going to something that's much more of like something in Unity, where they're actually going to say Revit, using Datasmith, bringing that model straight in there, and then they have the metaverse environment that they really wanted. But one of the things we did realize, it's everyone likes to trot out a good Eames quote now and then. And when we found that there's a lot of limitations, right? There's a lot of these constraints in the context of these metaverse environments. The poly count, like some of them, you're building with these voxel environments, so you have these really limited shapes that you can work with and textures and things like that.
Kind of Minecraft-esque.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And so constraints become opportunities in a lot of ways. And when we were talking with Vice Media, who worked with Big to develop their Viceverse space, it was interesting to hear them talk about how Big slowly evolved its thinking about what was possible in the metaverse. Because when they developed their first model, it was in Rhino, and it was essentially like an architectural model. It was that level of resolution. So they had stairs that a person could really walk up and things like that. And they're like, wait a second, no one's walking upstairs. You're
Just has to
teleporting.
represent it. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
It just has to
exactly.
represent an idea of some kind of a vertical circulation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's these ways in which you can, yeah, exactly. You're just sort of manipulating these things that, you're teleporting as opposed to walking and things like that. But you still have these constraints of the geometry, the hardware. It's inherently is going to be a constraint on the user side. And then you also have the aesthetic constraints. Everything looks similar. Like, when you go in and you see a Decentraland image, like each metaverse has its appearance style. It's kind of like, you just no mistake in a Lego. It's the same thing with the metaverse. They all have a certain vibe, so to speak. And for a lot of people, they don't want that, particularly as you start thinking about corporate campuses and things like that, that people want, they want their style,
Yeah.
not
Yeah, that
the
makes sense.
Decentraland style.
Yeah, so it's splintering into many more metaverses, right? In which are different destinations that are digital, and you would maybe hop into one or hop into another, like you would pop into a chat room back in the AOL days, right? And
You might, but you may not be able to say carry over your username and things like that. And I think that's a little bit of the piece that maybe is oversold on the value to consumers, at least right now, is the need for these metaverse environments to have sort of this seamless portability to go from one place to another. And one of the more interesting conversations I had was with the design firm Interior Architects IA, and they have a whole division that focuses on metaverse environments now. And apparently, on a per project basis, it's more profitable than traditional work, which is rather interesting.
less risky too.
Yeah, that's right. No one's going to sue you for a health, safety, and welfare issue. At least not that we know of yet. But
and there's no gravity, and there's all of these kind of, I don't know,
no mold risk.
Yeah, no mold. That's in your own house where you're wearing your goggles. It's interesting to think about it from maybe we should step back and just take away the magnifying glass for a minute and talk about the overall vision of even why are we even talking about the metaverse? I'm sure that part of your research kind of got into that, and the various companies with various visions of what it's going to offer people and why they would want to spend time there.
We did talk about that a lot with the people that we interviewed, and the best answer that we got, the one that really galvanized it for me, was saying that the metaverse is a three-dimensional website. That's essentially what it is. And so do you see value in traditional websites? Sort of yes or no. Well, then would you see more value in a three-dimensional website? And once I put that lens on it, to begin the understanding the idea that traditional web experience versus one where it truly is immersive, then it really started to click for me. And I think a lot of companies are seeing that. If you look at it, say, from a corporate perspective, an internal corporate management, say you have your employee portal for, say, HR or payroll, things like that, or maybe even just teams and data file and storage. how does that function versus something that you'd say was 3D? And would there be benefits associated with that type of environment for that type of functionality? And I think most people would say yes. It's easier to navigate in a lot of ways in the real world if you could than to do so purely through these 2D environments. And then you say you apply the same thinking to commerce. And is it easier to look at a web page where you're looking at, say, a bunch of different furniture options, just these icons on each one, and maybe you can rotate them, or would it be better to go into an environment where it really is immersive? You can actually walk around it. It can be virtually staged in an environment if you're choosing and things like that. So once I started to wrap my head around this idea of a website in 3 dimensions, it became pretty remarkable. And especially when we were talking with, in the context of media outlets, and they were saying that here's an idea where you can take a story and, maybe you have a long form story that people are still reading, but then think of the way in which you can say present artifacts that relate to the story. This is a story maybe about the conflict in Ukraine. You can have someone that could actually go into a 3D environment and actually see a javelin, see how the components of it, how does it function, things like that. And the capacity for that level of engagement you just can't get through 2D media. So for me, that's the big value in a lot of ways. Obviously, a lot of people are seeing some interesting value that may evince itself in the context of it's like the seamless operability and this global connectedness, or as you're saying, like the removal of gravity and those types of constraints. You can make it whatever you want. But I think in a lot of ways, it's really about that immersion as a big
Yeah,
part of it.
it really makes sense from a commerce standpoint to create an experience around the commodities or the objects that are on display. And that, it's thinking about it from a website perspective, there's this idea of experiential design. UI, UX in a 2D world is very different than user experience in a 3D world. And this is where the link becomes clear to architecture, right? And to interior architecture. If people are spending 90% of their time indoors, and I would argue that when they're indoors, most of their time is in front of a screen looking at a two-dimensional thing, scrolling, whether it's doom scrolling or scrolling for other reasons, right? But it's when you're scrolling through Amazon or Etsy or Nike or whatever, you're looking at stuff and it's kind of flying by versus having that immersive experience. I almost said real experience, but that's, I think, a debatable word when we're talking about this. To experience those things, those objects in the environment that somebody wants to affect you on an emotional level in a much more useful way than they can through a traditional web page design, right?
Exactly. I mean, if that factor didn't matter, then no one would bother with brick and mortar stores anymore, for instance. But clearly, it still does matter. I think the other component that is going to be particularly compelling in the area of commerce is the opportunity for interaction. It's social interaction, maybe shopping with other people. For instance, like my sister is a great arbiter of style when it comes to making sure I don't make any poor decisions. And
you do a
having
daily
her
check-in.
shop with me, yeah, exactly, would be amazing, right? And similarly, when you think about the opportunity for, say, someone to actually help you, someone to show you different products and talk you through different items. You can't do those things with a chat bot necessarily effectively, but you can in the context of these immersive environments.
And I think I know I have experienced this. I don't know if everybody has. It depends how you maybe consume media and the news. But like there are certain stories that will show up on the New York Times website or the Wall Street Journal. It's not just a web page. It's next level stuff, right?
Parallel coordinates and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
The things that are happening on that page and that are revealed as the story unfolds can be done in a very incredible way. The way that they present information, data, charts even, can be way better than a static two-dimensional image that, it just gives, there are technologies even in the 2D website world that lend themselves to better storytelling and immersion. And that is just pales in comparison to the things I think that we could imagine would be possible in a place like the Metaverse or in a three-dimensional website, right? Like you said, if it's a story about Neanderthals or whatever, and then I get to hold the tools virtually that they used to get from here to there, right? That would be an immersive, incredible experience that I really wouldn't be able to. I would just have to imagine it otherwise, right? We wouldn't even have the same experience, you and I, whereas we would then have a shared experience by through a means of conveying that information on a three-dimensional
I mean,
website.
I love that image. I'm actually thinking right now, you always talk about them hunting mastodons or something like that. And you think of, what exactly was the relationship in size between them and a mastodon? I mean,
And
having
the
something like,
visceral reaction you could get if one showed up, right?
yeah.
Because I mean, it reminds me of this YouTube channel. I think it was like Elderly React, and it was the elderly reacting to VR, the one that I saw, and they put them in these different VR scenarios. So they had a Vive that they put on their face, and there was a wide range of people in this group. There was elderly men and women and different races, and it was really interesting to see how they reacted to different things. And obviously it was very personality driven, right? It was like, put them on a roller coaster. Okay, some people love roller coasters and some people hate them. Okay, now put them in a zombie apocalypse, and so we're seeing how they're reacting to that environment. Some are cowering in fear, like going down into fetal position on the floor, and the other ones are pulling out their guns, just having the time of their life shooting zombies, right? And so, but those emotions were real in both cases. And that is how immersive it can be. And I think a lot of people eschew this idea of being in a virtual environment because they haven't tried it yet. And like, I know I've seen it firsthand where there's people who just write it off. And then when they do it, they're like, I've been missing this. This is amazing. Like, I'm never going to not design as an architect. I'm not going to not use this tool anymore. This is going to become a primary decision-making tool as I develop design. And to go from one extreme to the other, it's just like all it took was an experience to do that. But it actually took an experience, not just the armchair kind of perspective and keeping it at arm's length.
So one question I would ask in that context then is, do you think that there's a fear in sort of the resistant group that's out there that it can sort of cheapen reality in some ways?
Absolutely. I think and it's probably even deeper than that. It's like to be able to create something so emotionally effective, if it's really like, if we're really talking about architecture, like in a very pure sense, right? That's what architecture can do for people or to people, depending on how you're using it. But it's one of those things where it's like we're focusing on the tool, not the people who created the space, like the all powerful architect in podcasting air quotes, right? It's kind of taking something away from the agency of the individual because we're all focused on the experience happening in the tool. When, like, thinking long term, if they're really going to build that building or have that even metaverse building, it's no one's going to think of the architect then either, but they did create that experience. So I think it's just part of like, I'm not in the loop anymore. I'm not in control. There's a fear there. There's an obsolescence fear. I think there's a lot of psychology going on behind the scenes.
So I mentioned earlier that there weren't the same health, safety, and welfare considerations necessarily for designing the metaverse, but
maybe there are. Yeah.
Maybe there are, right? When you think about that emotional implications,
mental health,
yeah,
right.
Mental health. You talk about people cowering or whatnot. That's an emotional response. I mean, that is health in a lot of ways. So obviously, when we think about the importance of designers or architects having that oath, to uphold the health, safety, and welfare, you really need to have something similar in the context of these metaverse environments in many ways.
They need to have ratings like movies or video games, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. And
some kind of warning.
Right? Is this going to be the Boston City Hall, or is this going to be, something else that's a little bit lighter fare, the fairy tale cottage? But it is an important consideration, and it may be one of the reasons why there needs to be a component of intentionality on the part of people who are designing these spaces to understand that you're going to have an emotional response. But that emotional response also has a lot of benefit because it gives that engagement on the part of the user. So you talk about learning. So you learn a lot more, of course, when you're excited and engaged. And that was one of the interesting things we found, is that a lot of companies started these efforts as internal exercises around training and onboarding for employees. And they were starting to see so much engagement and excitement around them that they were beginning to say, okay, this actually could be a great outward facing opportunity. And so they're saying, okay, let's go to phase 2 of what something like this might look like. But you think of the training, it makes a lot of sense to have that emotional engagement.
It does. It does. I mean, how many times have you had to watch some video because it was required to watch it versus maybe an entirely different experience that would actually engage you? Because one of the things about putting on the goggles and being in this environment is it really truly is blinders to everything, all the other distractions in the world, right? Whereas right now, I'm talking to you. I could be looking something up on the web. I could be checking my email.
I'd
There's
be
a
impressed,
chat.
but yes.
There's all these things going on,
Yeah.
right? Everybody tunes out to some regard during any number of calls, video presentations, whatever. That is way less likely to happen when you've got a fully immersive experience. And if the experience is amazing, you would not even be tempted to buy those other
things. Your
things.
preference to do that. Yeah.
Right. So, and I do think that, it's interesting to kind of think about it from a architectural perspective. I don't know if you've been watching, like one of the hashtags that I keep track of is Midjourney. So there's a lot of people using Midjourney, which is an AI that is using text prompts to produce imagery, like DALL-E.
Yeah, we actually had a fun call the other day internally where people were showing some images they created.
And I've been looking at some that are, people have been tuning the prompts that they give Midjourney to create the imagery, and some of the stuff just looks absolutely mind-blowing, incredible. And they're coming at it kind of from an architect's perspective of creating space, whether it's interior, whether it's architecture, whether it's full cityscapes. And the imagery is absolutely incredible. Now, granted, it's a 2-dimensional image. There's no 3-dimensional anything to it, but I think we can see the convergence on a time frame that's going to happen. If I could inhabit those spaces that I'm seeing people produce, well, I'm seeing AI produce now, but through the prompting of people who are taking on when people are like, this is an amazing image, and the people are saying, thank you. It's like, well, how much did you actually contribute to that? It is favorable. I would want to be there. I would want to experience that. And you know what? I'd never have to dust it, right? I wouldn't have to maintain it. I wouldn't have to worry about the electric bill in that space or in that thing. And I think that when you see images like that, it does start to tell a compelling story of a place I would want to spend time in, right? Fully immersed.
But there's a remarkable opportunity for them to be truly ephemeral as well. It's like almost like a dream. It's a prompt. It's real. It's rendered in real time in a sense. You inhabit it. You inhabit the space that you're in. You can see what you can see around you, and then it's gone.
And I think it also, like the promise of tech like that in particular, gives people agency to manipulate it as they're experiencing it, potentially. I think that that's part of what makes architecture is that it affects people in a way that buildings, general background buildings do not. And when people have agency in the creation process of that, that's an interesting dynamic, right? And I think really great architects, they either don't allow that at all and they create their masterpiece, right? The Frank Lloyd Wright version, right? Where it's like he was the master of all things in that, versus people who are very involved in the process and the ownership of that project is way higher because they were a part of it. I could see this kind of virtual world having the ability to include if I'm not an architect, my thoughts and feelings about what this space could be like based on my agency in that space to just adapt it in real time.
It's a remarkable conceit on a couple of levels. One of them is that it may be a position where the architect isn't delivering a design, but they're rather delivering the machine or the tool for someone to create that
framework,
design.
Right?
Yeah. And that's a pretty remarkable shift. But in a lot of ways, it's something that would never have been possible before, but would be possible under that framework. So I love that idea, although that's quite a challenge, I think, for many designers. It's almost like you're a game creator at that point than anything else, or an environment creator, as opposed to delivering a set fixed environment.
Let's take a quick break to share more about our sponsors. You've already heard a lot about Avail as a longtime sponsor of the show, but wait, this is a new message for you, distinguished listener of the Troxel podcast. We can't talk about Avail's latest desktop release without talking dynamic paths. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, of course you do. Dynamic paths allow BIM managers to store data in BIM 360, OneDrive, or any other cloud solution. In the latest version of Avail, they expand on location agnostic, making content easier and faster to find for the user. Imagine not having to worry if the content is on a local network drive or in the gazillion cloud storage locations. How is this even possible? Pure magic. It's the stuff of unicorns and rainbows, my friends. Let's keep this just between you and me. Here's some of the details. Following on the promise of being content agnostic, Avail now makes location complexity a thing of the past. Content is more than Revit. It ranges from Rhino to AutoCAD to Office documents. Well, this is next level. We're talking network locations. Have you ever seen one location where all the project content lives? Snap out of it. Of course you haven't. Content can live anywhere, from the local network to BIM 360 to OneDrive to any other cloud location. Why does this matter? Well, good thing there are no dumb questions, because the answer is that it frees up users to concentrate on design, which pays the bills, and getting content into a project, not managing technical issues around network drives and paths. Let's face it, they aren't that good at that anyway. Avail's mission is to make finding content simpler and easier. Like our favorite architect Louis Kahn once asked, "Data, where do you want to live?" I don't think he really asked that question, but Avail allows teams to, so let's just roll with it. And hold the phone. For those of you who know what this means, Avail also supports federated data requirements. Data can live where it needs and must live, allowing users secure and simple access to it. So, what's the takeaway? What's the big picture here? Settle down, I have it right here. Avail is a platform that connects all types of data from all types of locations, hiding complexity. Try it today. Go to getavail.com to learn more. And now let's get back to our conversation.
But the other component that is interesting is it's bringing to mind a comment that one of the former CEO of Chaos Group, that it's merged with Enscape, Peter Matev was saying that he sees a dark future in a lot of ways with the potential for manipulation. And that's what's interesting here is when you think about once you start to sort of give up that control, that agency to that AI engine that is able to create these dreamscapes that you're responding to emotionally, is there opportunities to embed within that logic, unbeknownst to you as the consumer, layers of manipulation? And what are the appropriate fail-safes that could be implemented in that context?
And if you don't believe that that's possible, just look at Google or Facebook now, right? Like there was a time when before those where you felt like, okay, Yahoo or whatever was just a directory, right? It was a hierarchical directory of things on the internet. And then Google flipped that on its head and just said, it's all there. Just if you type in the right word, we're going to give you the results. Well, guess what? Giving the results is a manipulation in what order? And we've seen Google do that more and more and more and more. Like I know that there's been lawsuits between Yelp and Google, right? Where Google will favor their results over a Yelp result, for instance, right? And so it's been training people for a long time now to trust the Google machine, right? Whatever Google gives you, if it's not on that first page, it kind of doesn't exist, right? And that first page is highly gamified, right? There's incentives that I'm not aware of yeah, absolutely. And it's trained us to trust it, right? So very much a reality, I think, that has to be kind of dealt with as we move into this space, because it can be there is potential for manipulation easily, right? And companies have every incentive in the world to do that, because in a capitalistic society, growth is all that matters, right? So what does it take to grow? So you really do kind of have to have the ethic of what you're talking about, I think, especially as architects who are responsible for people's health, safety, and welfare. The problem is all the other people out there who don't have that oath, right? Who are willing to do whatever it takes.
Well, it's like the same thing, though. Would you want to go into a building that had never wasn't designed by an architect, didn't have stamped engineering drawings and things like that? You see what happens in earthquakes in some countries that they don't have that same type of infrastructure, and it's terrifying. So it's you can see an obligation or maybe an opportunity within that context. But the other side of it is also how do we create that informed user group? So we think about, if you go into a building, a great building, and maybe it elicits an emotional response, but if someone that maybe has a classical education or maybe a docent introduce them to this building, they understand why they feel the way they feel, or maybe where the precedents and the design that led to its final, the outcome that you're seeing. Maybe there's also an obligation on the part of us as the consumers as we move into this more immersive environment with the opportunity for emotional manipulation to be educated ourselves and be aware of how what levers are being pulled. How does it feel to know that those levers are being pulled? Maybe it's hard, good manipulation. It's like a con game, you don't know what's happening, but I would think that there's still some obligation on our part to be informed consumers or informed metaverse citizens, so to speak.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that part of the conversation could go on forever, but I would love to get into kind of this, the tool stack that you talked about for architects. And obviously there are many different destinations, and they kind of, I assume, kind of require their own stack to get into. So maybe just like start with a high level overview of what are the major players. You mentioned some of them already: Maya, 3ds Max, SketchUp, Rhino, whatever. But there's more to it than just modeling, right? There's so many other pieces to it.
There's definitely some more to it than modeling. So what we did is actually wasn't terribly complex. We started, like I said, with a multiple choice or the choose your own adventure book, so to speak. So what we found in this context is we started off, what is the first question you need to be asking yourself? And I think the first one is this a private metaverse or a public metaverse, so to speak? And the private ones, there's ones where people are truly creating their own spaces. But we went to, okay, these are established metaverse environments. So once you've made that particular decision, then it goes into, let's say if you're going into private, there's really at this point only one that we found that's fairly large and often used, and that's Mona. And Mona is one in which it supports actually a fairly large file size, and it also allows basically anything that's an FBX or an OBJ file as an input. So that opens up a pretty large opportunity as far as file imports.
Kind of doesn't matter what you model in at that point.
Exactly. So that's one where, like I said, you're seeing digital twins of high-end homes and things like that. You're seeing those sort of these private metaverses that come along with the house that you just bought, the real house that you bought, or the physical house. So that's one where that's a fairly simple mechanism that they have in place. That particular environment, the Mona environment, though, doesn't necessarily have the sort of the high level of interaction operability that comes with a more gamified environment, though. But it becomes in it's almost like a sort of a cloud hosted rendered version of your home or something like that. But let's say you want something that was more public, then it goes into, well, do you want to have a system with land ownership, or do you want to have one in which actually you don't own any land, but you're just more or less like creating an environment on the servers that are owned by one of these other entities. So let's say you do want to go with land ownership routes. So that's places where you're trying to get into like Decentraland, Somnium Space, and things like that. Then there's a decision that one needs to make about the type of modeling quality that they necessarily want. Do they want a non-voxel style, or do they want a voxel style, the much more blocky type spaces, like you're saying, like the Minecraft kind of spaces? And so once they make those particular decisions, you actually have proprietary building applications that are used within those environments. So oftentimes the people that we spoke to will use, say, Rhino to model things on a conceptual level, to understand how it looks, to share that. But then when it comes to actually modeling, they have to use these sandbox-like environments within the game environments themselves to create these spaces. And what was interesting for us is you wouldn't think that there would be a place for something like Enscape in the context of these metaverse environments, because you're using these proprietary modeling platforms and whatnot. But the challenge is that you're building in one platform, but it's going to exist in the metaverse. So how is it actually going to look once it's deployed in this metaverse environments? And people didn't know, like, well, how's my neighbor going to reflect off of what I have? The colors change a little bit and things like that. So there's actually this need for a real-time rendering solution, which kind of surprised us.
Because it helps you make, like we talked about this in the last time we talked, which was that you're making decisions using a tool like Enscape during design now that didn't present themselves until much later in the process before, right? When you actually got to final renderings or when you got to actually building the building, now you actually have the ability to make decisions because of the color that the building next to you is going to reflect onto yours or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So when I went to our product management team, I said, hey, I have this idea about potentially having the ability to render in real time, not just like what your building would look like, not in like the real world, but in say, these various metaverses. And, their hair just basically instantly went gray. They're thinking, oh my gosh, each one has its own proprietary visualization platform they're using, rule sets and all that. But, small market, but interesting concept. But the challenge that those have is that you do have a limited amount of files that could be imported. So you could say have a GTF or GLB file could be imported, but there's a 15 megabyte per parcel limit to these things. So, I mean, it's tiny. So that's one of the reasons why most of them end up building inside those proprietary design tools as a result. But you can also, if you want to start operating some level of interactivity, you can use a Unity SDK. And you can use that with the GLB file format to start to bring in a certain level of intelligence into that model that you're going to have.
Can you give some examples of what the different levels of intelligence might be like?
Yeah, so some of them might be like you maybe will be approaching an object, and like we saw one where it's kind of like a red pill and a blue pill kind of a thing, that sort of idea. There's ones where you might have, say, clothing that you could say, interact with, potentially even say try on as an NFT and things like that. So there's a little more like game type pieces that they would have. So what we're finding by and large is that they're starting with these modeling phases fairly early on with the modeling tools that architects are familiar with: Rhino, Revit, SketchUp, things like that. And then they're going to the modeling tools that are a little bit more aligned and compatible with the file formats that you're going to see as being able to be imported into the metaverse environment. So that's Blender, 3ds Max, Maya, ZBrush. And then you're going into the next phase, which is starting to add in the interactivity component. So that would be like the Unity TypeScript is typically what people are using. And then you have some components that are then either you can bring that directly in or you use that with a hybrid with those metaverse world specific builders at that point, depending upon what your file size is and things like that, or how tolerant you are of those particular builders. Like things like Roblox, you're going to do much more of it within their builder, for instance, and things like that. So you can see the first part of that stack is things that designers are pretty familiar with. It just starts to fall off as you get into things like Unity, TypeScript, Maya, things like that.
But a lot of firms have developers or, visualization teams who are familiar with those tools. And so they're going to potentially have a leg up because they are creating experiences. They're creating the ability for clients to go into a hospital space and move furniture around and change the color of the walls and in tools like that. And
exactly.
And
they're creating metaverse environments.
Right. They are.
Yeah. They're just not pushing them to these formal metaverse spaces at this stage. But I would not be surprised, and given the firms that we've talked to, there's real money in creating these metaverses that are not part of these larger structured traditional metaverse environments. So they are able to leverage those technology stacks that they have in-house, usually a small specialist team that's using those tools. But they're able to leverage them to deliver products for their clients that they really want, both that are employee facing, internally facing for onboarding, training, meeting spaces. And then now it's starting to emerge as customer facing.
Yeah. There's a whole topic of conversation here around what we're delivering and what the value of that is as well. Right. And that we're not broaching that subject. Maybe we will. I don't know if you have thoughts on it, but this is not part of the traditional standard of care. deliverables, any of those things. So like this, we're talking about way more specific or custom deliverables in this sense is in relation to the.
It's much more of a service offering and long-term service offering.
Yeah. And so when it comes to putting value to these kinds of things, I mean, maybe it's yet to be seen, but I'd be interested in hearing if you have any kind of initial thoughts on that, because I think that's part of the hurdle that many architects who've been around for a long time have to get over, or maybe they never will. But it's like, okay, that's just messing around. That's a game. That this is I do the real thing over here. But we're actually talking about being able to deliver something of potential value, at least to some segment of people. And then I'm just interested what your initial thoughts are on that.
So there's a couple of pieces of my initial thoughts. One of them that was fairly interesting is speaking with some of the designers that are starting to deliver buildings in this space. They say that when they are working on these metaverse environments, they're either internally facing or externally facing for a particular company. Their client group at that company is the C-suite. They're talking to the CEO or what have you. Like they're not talking to someone lower down in facility management or what have you. So I think when you think of where the value is, at least on the part of the customer side, they see an enormous value there. To the degree to which you're actually having people who usually are not involved in building projects are now being, or are involved in website projects are now being involved. To flip it around the other way, what is the value potentially to architecture firms as far as revenue opportunities? So saying before, where there's IA is already seeing this on a per project basis being more profitable than traditional projects, because not only is it you don't necessarily have all of the various subs that are coming in, all these various contractors or what have you that are providing additional services, so you get to keep more of the fee. But then it's also a relationship. You these are not a one and done type thing. These require constant maintenance, whether it be on the technical side or just maintaining the proprietary servers that are running this particular piece of software. So these are long-term relationships which have a lot of value. And typically those long-term relationships are also ones that can be leveraged to develop real buildings as well, or real projects at the same time. As far as the cost or revenue that's being seen here, we're seeing it really all across the board. I think it depends on the scale and scope, but just from the traditional metaverse environments like Decentraland, the type of fees that we were seeing or we were quoted were around that of a traditional complex website. So, maybe 80, 100,000 plus, and some of them getting into multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars were the types of fees in total that people were seeing. So it wasn't necessarily insignificant.
That's really interesting. I see that becoming more and more a topic of conversation, right? This is the kind of thing where if architects are kind of pre-positioned to be successful in this because of the psychological, emotional, spatial pieces to this puzzle and the expertise that we have in that, you are delivering value in addition to what you would do as a typical service or in lieu of, because maybe it doesn't lead to your traditional deliverable at all. I think that's really interesting to think about. It's interesting to also think that a client would spend, six figures on something that is just in the digital realm. But I think this also kind of starts to get into the conversation, and I don't know that we'll go here today either, but ownership of things that are digital. There's a big blurry gradient here of ownership.
I went, of course, I did the same thing. That was one of the primary questions I asked various folks about that. It's like, who owns these designs? Who owns, and a lot of it, of course, there's certain components of this code and whatnot that you might want to redeploy on subsequent projects and things like that. And that was a particular topic that no one wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole. So it was clear that it is not fully resolved.
It is interesting to think about clients who ask for certain software to be used in the creation of their project when it's like these, who cares is another way to answer that question. It's like, you asked for this final thing, here it is. You shouldn't care how I got there. But then when you start to think about facilities management and all those things, then that becomes more of a topic that matters. Yeah.
But at this stage, it's too loose. It's too much being defined. And I think if you were to go to anyone who is designing a space now, and maybe 3 years from now, it'll be a completely different technology stack. This isn't like, oh, we're using Rhino to Revit, Navisworks. I mean, it's fairly established, right? It's much more fluid. And I think part of that gets down to the fact that this is pushing up against these limits of technology, whether it be the rendering technology, the computational power, all those sort of things, and they're constantly being improved.
I do think about firms who have a large body of work. And one of the ways in which they are currently selling that work or marketing that work is just on their website, right? And so to kind of get back to this idea of a three-dimensional website and to think about how you could enhance the experience of somebody that could lead to a real building project or a metaverse building project, potentially, as it were, too. It really gives us the ability to communicate on a completely different level what we're capable of and what our ideas, how they make you feel, and the kinds of experiences you can have when you hire us to do your architecture. It seems like there's a huge opportunity there, but I don't necessarily think that we as the royal we, the profession is equipped to create those kind of experiences by default, but that's just another layer that we should be thinking about and potentially dealing with, right? I could see large firms definitely being kind of on the leading edge, maybe not bleeding edge of that movement, right? Because they do have more bespoke roles in their company on the technology side.
Well, that was one of the interesting things for us in this overall research and eventual presentation was how do we get into the metaverse for architects? And one of the first things we said is you need to have an example of the work. And we said exactly what you're saying. Create your own environment, whether it be in one of these formal metaverse places or maybe you're one that is separate from it. But yeah, exactly. Make your own space. And so there, all of a sudden, you have a great example that you can show every client and say, hey, this is something I can deliver. Yes, I'm doing this traditional building for you, but I have this as well. And to me, it's rather fascinating that that hasn't been leveraged as a mechanism for validating your capacity within this, because it's like the same thing. I know it's very hard for new architecture firms to get hired without a portfolio of work, obviously. It's the same thing here. If you don't have a portfolio of work, then how do you get that first job? So it has to be an investment in developing your own space first. But with so many firms that are doing, say, hybrid work environments, or as you were saying, a much more immersive way of experiencing the body of a firm's work. I mean, I'm already thinking of going in, seeing a beautiful vitrine with the model for the project. Then I'll look at the walls, see some images, maybe some over 360 panos that you could step in and walk or look around in. I mean, you can make a pretty incredible immersive environment for an architectural firm's body of
Yeah,
work.
and you could take it and you can take it way beyond that, right? Like to me, that's what's so interesting about the metaverse and its relationship with the real world. I had a guest on the podcast, Jason Gardner, who works at Populous, and they're looking at ways to engage fans that don't go to the game. There's new tech out there. We talked about it on the show. This video that was shown on LinkedIn, where every player on the field is continually tracked, and the ball is also tracked, and they're using motion control cameras, tracking, and all these things to also deliver a virtual experience where I could be at home, not there at the stadium, and I can actually be walking on the field as the game is going on. I mean, what soccer fan wouldn't want to experience that? And maybe it's not. It could be better than being there in the nosebleed section, right? So very different experiences. Not to say one replaces to the other, but they're potentially complementary, especially when you take location out of the scenario, right? So if I'm looking for a firm for a project in Southern California, I'm no longer limited to Southern California firms, because I could inhabit the buildings of any architect anywhere who could potentially deliver a project based on their qualifications here and not have to go visit their building in Indiana, right? To actually get that experience to do it. And I think that just kind of opens up this location agnostic practice idea that I think, because of remote and hybrid work, and because the pandemic taught us, right? Like, you actually don't need to be locked to a location to do this kind of work. And now you don't have to be locked to a location for the firm that you choose to do the work, right? It really can be based on the ideas and what that firm can actually deliver and how it makes the people who are the users of the building feel, because they've been able to experience it already. They know you can deliver it. I think that there's so much potential there. And if you put it on an open platform like you're talking about, then yeah, everybody gets to experience it.
Exactly. Everyone gets to experience it. And the idea of an office space that one could inhabit, whether it be for meetings internally or alternatively to show clients, it would be a pretty remarkable way of building a cultural bond as
And
well.
in education, my mind is racing right now. Education, like architectural history class, right? If you had the ability to experience, I would remember so much more about my architectural history class if I experienced those places that were in the slide carousel that I slept through almost every class.
Oh yeah, no, you not only experience them, but maybe you could even say take apart a wall and see the nature of the actual assembly of some of these things. The fill, or the old boats that were sort of thrown down and built on top of, used as fill in London and things like that. I mean,
It
it would be
would. It
incredible.
would. There was a small conference that I went to, and the topic was reality capture. There's some firms out there doing reality capture that then provide the assets for some of the things we were talking about earlier, like the Javelin idea or the Mastodon, right? Or a spacesuit, or the Smithsonian has this huge collection that this company has been contracted to scan as much as they possibly can. And if you go onto Google and you search for Neil Armstrong spacesuit, like you're going to actually see a 3D model of that spacesuit that has been 3D scanned. And so this kind of bridging of reality and digital and our ability to interact in the immersive ways and see things that I cannot go see. I can't see the Smithsonian's entire collection, right? They have some of it. They have a small portion of it on display in their museum in Washington, D.C., but the archives are enormous. And for us to have access to that kind of information, I think is another way to think about this kind of thing, right? Where how many designs have firms done that didn't end up getting built that were mind-blowing? They're amazing, right? I think that there's still a way to communicate what you're capable of, and you're not limited by the rules of, reality. So it does seem like there's tons of potential.
There's tons of potential, and we started off this conversation talking about some people that were experiencing VR for the first time and their emotional reaction. And one of the things as we all get older, and then the people we love get older as well, we're starting to notice that there's a lot of things that don't get done in one's life. Life's too short, whether it be for opportunities or what have you. And the opportunity to experience things through this type of medium could be a remarkable way of seeing more of the world, and really creating connections between people that they simply can't, because they're not able to have these shared experiences right now. But there's an opportunity through these types of environments and creating these environments for shared experiences, be able to see great cultural artifacts from all over the world, or cultural venues that you simply can't. Like I don't know if I'll ever get to see the pyramids in Egypt, for instance, but that would be a phenomenal experience to be able to do that. So I think that's one of the things that I also find so exciting about this, is that there's this mechanism by which you can open up experiences that would otherwise be closed off. And it's the same way with office buildings. There's some beautiful architecture that's happening now, but I don't get to go in because I don't have the right badge. But and at least in Decentraland's meta space, there's the Sotheby's auction house. I mean, they wouldn't let me in, of course. I mean, what could I possibly buy? But I'm able to walk in there. And if I can't go in, I just don't have access to it, and there's something about that also that's really liberating too. And that's one of the other things I really like about the metaverse, is that it offers up this opportunity for all of us to get into that VIP access, or to see behind
Or
the
to walk
curtain,
onto the field.
or walk onto the field, exactly, without getting arrested.
Without having to take all your clothes off for 10 seconds.
That's right.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I think these are all things that we should be thinking of as we are in a great place to take control, not even take control, but just participate and contribute to this thing that's going on, and have a voice in how it gets developed, the kinds of ethical implications that there are, the kinds of value implications that there are for architects in this space as well. It's really interesting. So I appreciate the topic. Is there anything else that we should cover that we missed here?
No, I think we really hit on all of the key points. I would only say that people shouldn't shy away from experimentation. They have to recognize that there's not going to be a set path at this point. So your best opportunity is just to go in and get your hands dirty. Get on Discord, talk to some of the people that are already making and designing these spaces, go in and explore some of these metaverse environments, and acknowledge the fact that there isn't going to be a textbook at this point. But there are clear tools that are being used, and those are ones that are familiar to architects. So there's no reason to shy away from this opportunity.
Are there any Discord servers in particular that you would recommend as a starting point?
I can't say off the top of my head. I wish I was that sharp with this right now, but I'm sorry.
No, that seems like one of those things, though. It's like every Discord server out there is kind of, you can't see it from another one, right? And so kind of like these different metaverse destinations, I think it's similar in that way. So maybe the most helpful tip we can give here is to actually do searches online for metaverse and Discord servers where those kind of conversations are happening, because I'm sure there's a lot of knowledge that, if I've noticed anything from communities who are on Discord, is they put a lot of effort into organizing frequently asked questions, getting started, kind of onboarding kinds of things, because they don't want to keep answering the same questions. So they actually, unlike an architecture firm, they're very good at kind of knowledge capture and putting it into places where then you can spend a little bit of time reading before you start asking questions. But that gives you a great kind of onboarding first experience, at least a peek into what's going on there. So maybe that's the search is Metaverse and Discord servers.
I think that would work well. And then maybe if there's an opportunity to provide a bit of information and go in some notes or something that goes along with this, I can send it to you afterwards.
Yeah, the show notes will have links to as many of the things that I've written down during our conversation, so that people don't have to search for it themselves. So yeah, if you have other contributions to that, I'll be sure to include them.
Absolutely.
Well, Roderick, thanks so much. And is there any new Enscape news that we should be aware of?
I would say that there's two big pieces that really have us excited. The first is, obviously 3.4, which is our first release that really focused on fixing bugs.
Nice.
So it's rare when you get an opportunity to say, there's big splashy features.
New features. What about those bugs that I encountered?
Exactly. So that's exactly what we did. We realized, sometimes it's good to do a little bit of housekeeping and focus on that. So that's a shift for us, and it's one that we think that our customers will really appreciate. We have, along with that, shortly thereafter, we released our first commercial version for Mac, which is SketchUp only at this point. It's a pretty big deal for us, not only because it's a whole new platform, obviously, and a whole new world, which has been challenging. Mac is a different beast. There's no doubt about it. But it starts to open up also, and we're just going right into the development for other very Mac-focused platforms like Vectorworks and ArchiCAD. So that has us pretty excited as well, because there's a lot of people for whom, and a lot of industries are really heavy on Mac. And so now we're going to be able to tap into those. The other thing, though, is that we have with the merger with Chaos, we're starting to really bear some fruit there. And so with the beta version of V-Ray that's out, there's actually now a bridge between Enscape and V-Ray. So you can export from Enscape, your render brings in and converts all of your Enscape materials into V-Ray materials and things like that. So it's really exciting to start to see that, where people can start to get that photo reel, that perfect image via that connection. So that's something where I would definitely encourage some people to get their hands on that beta version and give it a try.
It's interesting because the whole, V-Ray dominated the market for so long as this kind of end of the phase rendering engine, right? It was the photorealistic, it was the one that went on the job site sign. It was the one that went on the website. And then we saw people who do the work really gravitate towards the real-time engines like Enscape to visualize without the time cost, the penalty of rendering.
It's significant.
It's significant. It can't, yeah. And so it totally makes sense to kind of get back to the point now where there is a rendering pipeline that goes, because there are quality differentiators in rendering over time, right? There's so, you're telling that story over time. And for for you to be able to not have to start over in a different package so you can convert and upgrade and just take it to the next level makes total sense. So that's
And
cool to
we're
hear.
excited about it, and we're hoping that for a lot of people, it'll lower that threshold of engagement when it comes to V-Ray. For a lot of firms, actually, we're finding that Enscape's perfect. They don't want to do anything more, which is an interesting statement about how important is photoreal in a lot of ways. But I think something that I'm putting on us as a challenge is to really show the community the value of that increased quality potential. It's a little bit like your iPhone camera. I mean, they're really good, but the pros use a DSLR for a reason. But we need to make that argument, I think, at least internally, and make that justification. So it's a little bit of a marketing challenge on our part to actually prove that you need that extra level of quality. So that's something I'm actually looking forward to doing and to showing our customer base that there's some value add to be had.
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts on that, but I don't think they would be well received right now. I think that, the thing that I think about when architects don't mind not having to worry about that stuff anymore, right? All of those settings. There was a vocabulary there that did not make it to the architectural side of things. It was very much on the viz side of things. And so if that kind of thing is being addressed, especially if I can get 70, 80% of the way there in Enscape and then just push it into this other package that helps me get that remaining, and there is value there that you can prove to me, I think that would be fantastic. But like I said, I don't think most architects don't miss it at all because it was such a bear.
Yeah. I did a presentation about UI UX a while ago, and I had talked to our engineers internally about their philosophies, and basically from that I created a slide that had 3 different images. One of them was a self-driving car that doesn't even have a steering wheel. Then one of them is, a car that is, say, like we're familiar with more or less. And then the other one was the cockpit of a Boeing 747. And that's basically sort of the continuum. No one wants to fly the 747 anymore. And no one really wants the completely driverless car. They want to be in the middle. And frankly, that's where Enscape is. So I think we're in a position where we have to, like I said, we really have to prove the added value that you get from that high level of control. And if you can't, then, we're in a tough position to make an argument, to be perfectly honest, I think. So that's why I like that it challenges us to say, okay, this is why it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. And development has not stood still on Enscape. Like you said, you just released a new version and some new features in there as well, I think. Is one of them, at least, is you can have different sun settings per kind of saved view, right? So that's
yeah, exactly. That's like one of the little features that we have, and then some other things that we're working on for the future is around parametric assets. This is under development. So the idea being is that you can have maybe one master asset, but then multiple variations of it. And so right now, what we've been doing is actually talking to customers and asking, well, what exactly do you want for different assets? Obviously different colors, different textures, things like that. But there's some unusual ideas that we've been considering, like say weathering and aging, for instance, the same asset, but can you show it over time and things like that are of interest. So we've been really enjoying the conversations with different customers. And as always, you never get one answer other than everything.
Yep, we want it all.
Yeah, so that's our job, to take all that and try to come up with something that really does meet the needs of our users. But that's where the fun is, honestly.
Yeah, exciting. Well, thanks for taking the time today. This has been a fantastic conversation. I hope others get value out of it as well. There's definitely some things to we should all be thinking about and having conversations like these about. So I encourage everyone to do that. Comment on the episode. You will be able to get in contact with Roderick. I'll put a link to his LinkedIn in the show notes. And connect with him, connect with me, keep the conversation going. And until next time, thanks for the conversation. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Evan. My pleasure.
Thank you to Avail for their support of this podcast episode. Visit getavail.com to see their holistic approach to content management today. This show is part of the Gabled Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gabledmedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for eTroxel. Talk to you soon.